If you asked 100 people what an ostrich does when it's scared, most of them would say the same thing. It sticks its head in the sand. It's one of those facts that everybody just knows. Kids' books draw it, cartoons joke about it, people use it as an insult. Quit burying your head in the sand, meaning stop ignoring your problems. There's just one issue. Ostriches have never done this. Not once. Not as a defense mechanism, not by accident, not ever in the entire recorded history of anyone actually watching an ostrich. So today we're asking two questions. First, what would actually happen if an ostrich tried this? And second, and more interesting, if it's not true, where on earth did the idea come from, and why has it survived for something like 2,000 years? Let's start with the biology, because this part is quick. An ostrich's head weighs several pounds and sits on the end of a neck that can be 3 feet long. If an ostrich buried that head in sand, it would be doing two things at once: cutting off its own airway and blinding itself in an environment that's already full of predators. Ostriches are the largest living bird on Earth. They can't fly, but they can run in short bursts at speeds that rival a car in a school zone. And their primary defense is exactly that: running. A secondary defense is a kick powerful enough to injure a lion. Voluntarily suffocating yourself face down in dirt is, evolutionarily speaking, the opposite of a survival strategy. Animals that did this would not have survived long enough to become one of the most successful large bird species on the planet. So the myth isn't just unproven, it's actively contradicted by basic anatomy. But myths like this usually aren't invented from nothing. Something real is almost always sitting underneath them, slightly distorted. So what's the real behavior that might have started this? There are two strong candidates. The first involves eggs. Ostriches dig shallow nests directly in the ground, sometimes over a foot deep, and both parents take turns sitting on and tending the eggs. Every once in a while, a parent will lower its head down into the nest to turn the eggs with its beak, keeping them at an even temperature. From a distance, especially in poor light, this looks exactly like a bird lowering its entire head into the ground. It's not sand burial, it's just very ordinary parenting, but the silhouette is close enough to plant the idea. The second candidate is about hiding. When an ostrich senses danger and can't run, often a mother protecting a nest, it will flatten its neck and head along the ground and stay completely still. Because ostrich feathers are colored to blend with dry grass and soil, a flattened neck can genuinely look like the ground has just swallowed the bird's head. It's camouflage, not burial. The head isn't underground, it's just lying still on top of it. Put those two behaviors together, egg turning and neck flattening, and you have everything you need for an outside observer watching from a distance without binoculars to walk away and describe something that never actually happened. Now here's where it gets genuinely old. This isn't a myth that started with a cartoon in the 1900s. It goes back to the Roman Empire. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder wrote a massive encyclopedia in the 1st century AD called Natural History, cataloging everything the Romans believed about the natural world: plants, animals, minerals, all of it. In his section on ostriches, he described them as believing that once their head and neck were hidden, their entire body was concealed too. Read carefully, that's not quite ostriches bury their heads in fear. It's closer to ostriches seem to think that if they can't see you, you can't see them, which honestly sounds a lot like an animal hiding its head in tall grass or flattened against dry earth, exactly like the camouflage behavior we just described. Over the centuries, as this idea got repeated, translated, and simplified by writers who had never seen an ostrich in person, hides its head to feel hidden slowly morphed into buries its head in the sand. That's a pattern worth noticing on its own. The original claim was already a stretch, and every retelling after that stretched it a little further. Once an idea like this lands in a widely copied text like Pliny's, it has a long life ahead of it. For most of European history, encyclopedias like his were treated as authoritative reference works, copied by monks, quoted by later naturalists, and passed down for well over 1,000 years with very little independent verification. Almost nobody writing about ostriches in medieval Europe had ever actually traveled to see one in the wild. By the time explorers and naturalists were writing in the 1600s and 1700s, the phrase had calcified into something close to an accepted fact, showing up in bestiaries and nature guides. And crucially, it had also become useful, because burying your head in the sand is a genuinely great metaphor. It's short, visual, and instantly understandable. You don't need to have ever seen an ostrich to get what it means. That usefulness is really the second half of why this myth survived. A boring, mildly inaccurate fact about bird nesting behavior probably fades out over time, but a vivid metaphor for denial and avoidance is something people want to keep using, so the fact behind it gets protected by the phrase's popularity long after naturalists knew better. By the 1800s and 1900s, biologists studying ostriches directly had thoroughly documented that this never happens. It's been in zoology textbooks for well over a century, and yet the myth is arguably more widely known today than the correction. That's partly because most people's exposure to ostriches isn't a zoology textbook. It's a cartoon, a children's book illustration, or a passing joke in conversation. Those formats aren't trying to be accurate, they're borrowing a familiar image because it's funny and instantly recognizable. Every time that image gets reused, it reinforces the myth a little more, completely independent of what scientists have actually established. It's a nice example of how a piece of folklore can become essentially immune to correction, because the thing keeping it alive isn't belief in its accuracy, it's the convenience of the image. Which brings us to where the phrase lives now, almost entirely as language, not as a claim about birds. When someone says a person is burying their head in the sand, nobody actually thinks they're accusing that person of ostrich-like behavior. It's understood purely as a metaphor for ignoring an obvious problem instead of dealing with it, used in politics, business, relationships, health, pretty much any context where someone is avoiding an uncomfortable truth. In a strange way, the myth has outlived its own subject. The ostrich is almost incidental now. The phrase works because everyone already knows the image, even though the image was never real. So the real story here isn't really about ostriches at all. It's about how a 2,000-year-old exaggeration, built on a real but misread behavior, got copied, simplified, and repeated by people who'd never seen the animal, until it hardened into common knowledge. And there's a small irony worth sitting with. The phrase we use to describe someone refusing to look at an uncomfortable truth is itself a fact most people have never bothered to look at closely. If you learned something, subscribe. We're doing more of these "everyone knows this but it's actually wrong" videos soon. And let us know in the comments, what's another animal fact you always assumed was true?